People think losing privacy feels loud until one morning you open your curtains and realize silence can look unfinished. At 6:37 on a Tuesday morning, I opened the blinds in my living room with coffee in one hand and immediately knew something was wrong. Not because something appeared, because something disappeared. My front yard looked wider, brighter, exposed. For a second, I thought the light was strange. Then my brain caught up. The hedge was gone. 14 years of dense green hedges along my property line had disappeared overnight. Not trimmed, not shaped, gone. In their place sat raw dirt, tire tracks, chopped roots, and a line of exposed earth running 72 feet across the edge of my yard like somebody erased a sentence and forgot to rewrite it. Right in the middle stood a white plastic landscape marker. Black printed letters. HOA landscape correction completed. I stared at it for maybe 10 seconds before stepping outside in socks. Cold concrete. Damp air. Fresh-cut plant smell still hanging in the morning. Somebody had done this recently. The stumps were clean. Soil still dark. There were faint tracks where equipment rolled across the grass. I walked the length of the property slowly. 1 step. 2 steps. 72 feet. My father planted those hedges with me when I bought the house. First spring after move-in. We rented a trencher. Spent 2 weekends leveling soil. Measured spacing with string lines because he refused to eyeball anything. Every shrub exactly 30 inches apart. Every row straight. He used to say privacy should feel natural, not defensive. Over the years, the hedge became normal. Birds nested in it. It blocked afternoon traffic noise. Hid garbage bins. Gave the yard shape. After my father passed away, I kept trimming it the same way he taught me. Not because the hedge mattered. Because routine did. And now there was a dirt strip where memory used to be. I walked back inside. Put coffee down. Grabbed my tape measure. My father's old one. Metal case. Scratched edge. Started measuring. 72 feet total removal. Average depth 28 inches. Clean equipment marks. No storm damage. No disease. No city markings. Deliberate. Then I checked cameras. Front camera footage started at 8:13 p.m. previous evening. Headlights. Landscaping trailer. 3 workers. Reflective vests. 1 clipboard. Then she stepped into frame. Patricia Dawson. White jacket. White SUV parked at the curb. HOA board member. 56. The kind of person who speaks in paragraphs and smiles before delivering bad news. She pointed at the hedge. Workers nodded. Equipment started. She stood there watching with folded arms while 14 years disappeared in 23 minutes. At one point, she actually stepped into my yard and adjusted one of the safety cones. Like she was supervising a community mural. Then they placed the sign and left. I watched the footage twice. No emergency. No notice. No conversation. Just certainty. 20 minutes later, my phone rang. Unknown. No. Patricia. I answered. She sounded cheerful. Nathan, good morning. I wanted to let you know we completed a landscaping improvement. Improvement. I looked out the window at dirt and asked what she meant. She explained the hedge had become visually heavy and inconsistent with neighborhood openness goals. Neighborhood openness goals. I asked who approved entering my property. Small pause. Then she said HOA discretion allows corrective aesthetic action. I looked at the empty line of dirt and asked if she had paperwork. Another pause. Then she changed subjects and said I would probably appreciate the cleaner look once I adjusted. Adjusted. That word stayed with me. I thanked her for letting me know and ended the call. No argument. No yelling. Just silence. Then I grabbed a notepad and started writing. Property line dimensions. Removal depth. Camera timestamps. Survey reference numbers. My father had another rule. If somebody changes your property without asking, do not start by reacting. Start by measuring. I stood in the middle of the exposed yard holding the tape measure while morning sunlight poured through a space that used to belong to Hedges and realized something. I was not going to plant another shrub. My father used to say that people reveal what they think they own by what they touch when nobody asks them to. That morning after measuring the empty line where the hedge used to stand, I did not call anyone. I did not post online. I did not march to Patricia's front door holding screenshots and righteous energy. I made breakfast. Eggs. Toast. Coffee. Then I sat at my kitchen table looking directly at the exposed front yard through the window while writing numbers into a yellow notebook. Property line distance. Estimated replacement volume. Equipment tracks. Camera timestamps. People always assume staying calm means not caring. Usually it means caring enough not to waste motion. Around noon, I walked outside with gloves and started cleaning roots. Not because I planned to replant, just because I wanted to see what remained. Fresh cuts, deep extraction. They did not trim surface growth. They removed entire root systems. Somebody intended permanence. I knelt down and brushed dirt aside with my hands until I found the old irrigation line. Still there. My father and I installed that line ourselves. We buried it carefully because he hated visible hoses. Suddenly, I remembered the day we planted everything. 93 degrees. Cheap work gloves. My father standing in the yard holding a measuring string and refusing to move until every stake lined up. I remember complaining that nobody would notice if spacing was off by 2 inches. He looked at me and said something I did not understand until years later. You do not build boundaries for other people. You build them so you know where your effort lives. At the time, I thought he was talking about landscaping. Turns out he was talking about life. Around 1 o'clock, I noticed Patricia outside. White SUV, white blouse, matching decorative stones around her mailbox because apparently commitment matters. She saw me working and walked over with the confidence of somebody expecting gratitude. She stopped at the edge of my property and smiled. Nathan, I know change feels uncomfortable at first. I stood up slowly and looked at her. She gestured toward the empty space and said the street already looked more open. More open. Interesting choice of words for removing somebody else's privacy. I asked who approved the work order. She said landscape concerns were reviewed. Internally. I asked if she had written homeowner authorization. She smiled politely and said HOA guidelines allow aesthetic intervention under certain conditions. I nodded and asked which section. Small pause. Then she said she would send documentation later. That answer told me everything. My father also had a rule about construction. If somebody cannot tell you the measurement, they probably invented the wall. Patricia kept talking. She explained that hedges sometimes become exclusionary and communities function better with visual continuity. Visual continuity. She said it like she invented neighborhoods. Then she pointed toward my front yard and said something that actually made me laugh. You could do something cleaner now. Cleaner. I looked at the exposed dirt, then at her perfectly arranged landscaping, and suddenly realized something strange. She did not think she destroyed something. She thought she upgraded it. That changed the entire problem. Angry people are easy to predict. Helpful people with no boundaries are impossible. I smiled and said thank you for the feedback. She looked disappointed. Again, people expecting conflict always seem confused by calm. She walked away. That evening, I pulled every document related to the house. Survey maps, purchase paperwork, county setback requirements, original landscaping records, HOA guidelines. I spread everything across the dining table. My engineering job taught me something useful. Most conflicts stop being emotional when dimensions appear. I started reading. Page after page. Landscape sections. Exterior approvals. Visibility language. Maintenance clauses. Nothing. Trim standards. Dead vegetation rules. Fence restrictions. Still nothing. No removal authority. No entry permission. No corrective landscape access. At 8:14 p.m., I found the original property survey. Folded paper. Yellow edges. My father's handwriting in the corner from years ago. One sentence circled in blue ink. Private landscape improvements within boundary line. I stared at it for a second and smiled. Then I rolled the survey closed, grabbed graph paper, and for the first time all day I stopped thinking about what had been removed and started thinking about what could legally stay forever. There is a moment in every construction project when you stop asking whether something should exist and start asking how permanent you want it to become. That week I stopped looking at the empty yard like damage and started treating it like a site survey. Every evening after work, I sat at the dining table surrounded by papers, measurements, county maps, and HOA documents. I did not need revenge. I needed geometry. I highlighted every line that mattered. Fence restrictions, setback requirements, landscape definitions, exterior structure language, height limits, visibility rules, decorative material allowances. My father always said rules are just blueprints written with words. Most people lose because they stop reading after the title. By Thursday night, I had something more valuable than anger. I had blank space and legal dimensions. Friday morning, I took the survey map to the property line and started measuring again. 72 feet. Side clearance compliant. No easement conflict. Maximum allowable structure height lower than privacy fence restrictions, but higher than hedge replacement standards. Interesting. I marked corners with orange flags. Nothing dramatic. Just small markers. Around noon, Patricia noticed. She walked over carrying iced coffee and concern disguised as friendliness. She smiled and asked if I was replanting. I smiled back and said I was evaluating options. She nodded approvingly and said the board would appreciate something cleaner and more community-aligned. Community-aligned. That phrase had become background music at this point. She looked at the flags and asked whether she could see the plan. I said not yet. She laughed and said she was excited to see something fresh. I thanked her and kept measuring. She stood there longer than normal waiting for more information. There was none. That evening I visited the county office website and confirmed something twice because it felt almost too convenient. Certain non-habitable decorative masonry structures were allowed within setback limits if properly placed and under height thresholds. Decorative masonry. Interesting wording. I printed the regulation and pinned it beside my father's old survey. Then I drove to a local materials yard the next morning. Not because I was buying, just looking. Rows of stone, retaining blocks, concrete textures, modular systems. Most people think concrete only comes in gray. They have clearly never met somebody whose job involves infrastructure. There were finishes that looked like slate, sandstone, clean architectural lines. Some systems stacked dry, some locked together. Strong, quiet, permanent. I walked slowly through the yard until I reached the cinder block section. Simple, rectangular, honest. I stood there for a second and suddenly remembered something from when I was 12. My father helping our neighbor rebuild a garden wall after a storm. I asked why they did not just plant bushes. He said bushes ask people to cooperate. Walls ask people to adapt. At the time I thought that sounded dramatic. Now it sounded practical. Sunday morning I returned home and started sketching. Straight runs, integrated planters, drainage, shadow lines, decorative cap blocks. Not a fortress, just enough mass to create privacy without pretending to be landscaping. The funny part was realizing I could make something cleaner than the hedge. Cleaner. Patricia's word. Around noon she appeared again. White sneakers. Clipboard this time. She looked at the graph paper and asked what I was drawing. I turned the page over and said possibilities. She smiled and reminded me exterior changes require approval. I nodded and said absolutely. She looked satisfied and walked away. That was my favorite part. She still thought this was a conversation about aesthetics. She had no idea it had become a conversation about definitions. That evening I submitted one request. Clean packet, site plan, dimensions, material specifications, height compliance, drainage notes. No emotion, no mention of the hedge, no accusation, just paperwork. Under project description, I wrote one sentence. Decorative privacy enhancement replacing previous landscape feature. Submit. Confirmation email received. Then I walked outside and stood in the empty line of exposed dirt where 14 years of green used to live. Wind moved across the open yard without resistance. I looked at the survey stakes, then at the house, and smiled for the first time all week because I realized something. They removed something that grew slowly. I was about to build something that would not. The approval arrived faster than expected, which immediately made me suspicious. People think obstacles are obvious. Usually the dangerous ones are the doors that open too easily. Tuesday morning at 9:12 I received the HOA response email. Approved pending standard construction compliance. No comments. No objections. No requests for revisions. Just approved. I read it twice because Patricia had spent an entire week explaining visual continuity and neighborhood openness, and now suddenly decorative masonry was acceptable. Interesting. I printed the approval and added it to the binder. My father kept binders. I inherited the habit and apparently the personality. That afternoon, I called utility marking services, confirmed drainage routes, and ordered materials. 48 cinder blocks, capstone pieces, base gravel, landscape fabric, structural adhesive, clean architectural finish. Not industrial, not defensive. The goal was simple. Build something that looked intentional enough nobody could argue it appeared emotional. Construction started Saturday morning. Delivery truck at 7:04. Pallets dropped exactly along the driveway. The sound of concrete blocks being unloaded has a very specific weight to it. Deep. Final. Neighbors noticed immediately. Of course they did. Nothing attracts attention in an HOA neighborhood faster than visible progress. Frank from across the street appeared holding coffee because apparently his role in life was witnessing other people's projects. He looked at the pallets and asked one question. "You building a castle?" I smiled and said decorative privacy enhancement. He laughed hard enough to spill coffee. By 8:30 I had strings set and trench lines marked. Not deep, just enough for leveling and drainage. I worked methodically. Measure. Level. Compact. Repeat. My father always said permanent things become expensive when you rush cheap decisions. Around 10, I felt somebody watching. Patricia. White visor today. Standing at the sidewalk with the expression people use when they think reality made a clerical error. She walked over slowly and looked at the materials. Then she looked at the plans clipped to my work table. She smiled politely and asked if this was temporary. I said no. She asked if I was rebuilding the hedge. I said no. She looked confused. Then she asked what exactly I was building. I handed her the approved plan packet. She read the title, Decorative Privacy Enhancement. Her eyes moved slower after that. She flipped pages. Dimensions. Material descriptions. Height compliance. Drainage notes. Her expression changed slightly. She asked who approved it. I smiled and said the board. Long pause. She looked at the blocks again and asked if decorative masonry really counted as landscaping. I shrugged and said apparently definitions matter. She stood there for a second and then asked whether it would look severe. I looked at the empty strip where the hedge used to be and said cleaner. That word landed exactly the way I wanted. She nodded once and walked away. Construction continued. Base layer. Alignment checks. First row placement. By late afternoon, a low, clean line started appearing across the property. Not tall, not dramatic, just impossible to trim. Sunday morning, neighbors slowed down while walking dogs. One person asked if I was adding raised planters. Another said it looked modern. Nobody said fortress. That part mattered. If you build like revenge, people notice. If you build like architecture, people adapt. Around noon, Patricia returned. Clipboard again. She walked the full length of the work area and finally asked if I would reconsider softer materials. Softer materials. Interesting phrase from somebody who removed plants with machinery. I smiled and said I already did. That answer seemed to bother her more than anger would have. She stood quietly looking at the clean gray line stretching across 72 feet of property, and suddenly I realized something. She finally understood. Hedges could be adjusted, trimmed, corrected, reviewed. This could not. I kept working until sunset. First course complete. Straight lines. Perfect spacing. Concrete dust on my boots. Wind moved across the front yard differently now. Not blocked. Redirected. I stepped back and looked at the beginning of something permanent sitting exactly where something temporary used to live, and for the first time since opening the blinds that Tuesday morning, the yard stopped looking unfinished. By the second weekend, the wall stopped looking like a project and started looking inevitable. That was the moment people changed. Construction has a strange effect on neighbors. Everyone has opinions when something is theoretical. Once blocks start stacking, opinions become observation. Saturday morning was cool and dry. I rolled the mixer into position even though most of the structure used compacted base and locking sections. My father used to say visible work makes people assume invisible planning never happened. He was wrong. The invisible planning is what scares people when they finally notice it. By 8 a.m. the second course was in place. Straight lines. Clean spacing. Shadow gaps. Not tall enough to feel aggressive. Just tall enough to feel intentional. The gray finish actually worked better with the house than the old hedge did. I hated admitting that. Around 9 I noticed something unusual. Nobody was slowing down to stare anymore. People started complimenting it. Frank walked over carrying coffee again and said the annoying part was that he kind of liked it. I thanked him for his emotional support. He laughed and asked if I planned to paint it. I said no. Concrete does not apologize. Around noon, Patricia arrived. Not alone this time. 2 HOA board members with clipboards. That immediately made me smile, because people only bring clipboards when they need authority to feel visible. They walked the property line slowly, measured with their eyes, checked papers. Patricia looked unusually careful. Less certainty, more searching. One board member asked if they could see permits. I handed over the binder. Survey, approval packet, material specifications, compliance notes, county references, everything tabbed. Nobody spoke for a while. Then Patricia finally said she believed there may have been misunderstanding. During approval. Interesting sentence. I asked whether she meant before or after removing my hedge. She ignored that. She pointed to the wall and asked whether this still qualified as landscape enhancement. I opened the approval packet and pointed to the project title. Decorative Privacy Enhancement Replacing Previous Landscape Feature. Her eyes paused there. Then she asked if modifications could still happen later if community needs changed. Community needs. I almost laughed. I asked if decorative masonry remained subject to aesthetic correction after installation. One board member quietly flipped pages and said not unless non-compliant. Patricia looked at him immediately. He looked back at the paperwork. Nobody said anything for a few seconds. Then she asked whether I had considered softer alternatives. I looked at the exposed dirt line where roots used to be and said I did. That answer landed harder this time. The board members thanked me and left. Patricia stayed behind for a second. She looked at the wall and then asked something that surprised me. Why not just replant? Not defensive. Actual question. I thought about it and answered honestly. Because plants need trust. Structures need measurements. She looked at the blocks for a long second and nodded once before walking away. That evening I worked until sunset. Third course complete. Cap alignment dry fit. Drainage checked. Wind changed direction again. The yard felt different now. Quieter. Not blocked. Defined. Around dinner time my phone buzzed. Neighborhood message board. Somebody posted a photo of the project with the caption Modern Privacy Update. Comments started appearing. Looks clean. Better than expected. Good use of materials. One comment made me stop scrolling. Someone wrote, "Wait, why was the hedge removed in the first place?" No answer appeared underneath. Interesting. Sunday morning I came outside and found something sitting near the driveway. Small nursery pot with a young hedge plant inside. No note. Just one plant. Later another appeared. Then another. Neighbors dropping replacements. Not because they wanted me to rebuild. Because they suddenly realized something had been taken without being asked. I lined the pots neatly along the garage wall. Around sunset Patricia drove by slowly. She looked at the wall, looked at the hedge pots, and kept driving. No stopping. No clipboard. I stood there with concrete dust on my boots and realized the strange part of all this was not that I was building something stronger. It was that everyone finally noticed the original thing should never have disappeared at all. The complaint arrived on a Monday morning in an envelope thick enough to look important and thin enough to be disappointing. I found it clipped to my mailbox with an HOA logo in the corner and the kind of formatting that tries very hard to sound official. Inside was a notice requesting immediate review of recently installed visual barriers due to potential incompatibility with neighborhood character standards. Potential incompatibility. I read it once, folded it, finished my coffee, and went back to laying capstone pieces. My father used to say the second most expensive sound in construction is somebody saying we need to revisit the plan after concrete arrives. The first most expensive sound is silence before they realize the plan already exists. By then the wall was almost complete. Final course stacked. Cap blocks dry fit. Integrated planter pockets installed every 12 feet so the structure looked intentional instead of defensive. I had even added low lighting channels because if people were going to stare, they might as well get ambience. The funny thing was the yard looked better than before. Cleaner lines. Better drainage. More usable space. It did not feel closed. It felt finished. Around 10 Patricia appeared carrying a folder and what I can only describe as prepared disappointment. She stopped near the driveway and asked if we could talk. I nodded and handed her a pair of clean gloves because I was moving blocks. She stared at the gloves for a second and declined. She held up the notice and explained that several concerns had been raised regarding the permanence of the installation. I asked who raised them. She looked at the paper and said community feedback. Community feedback is one of those phrases that usually means one person with confidence and access to email. I asked whether there were formal complaints. She said not exactly. Then she asked if I would consider modifying the design. I asked whether the wall violated any written standard. Long pause. She said no. Then she said it felt inconsistent with neighborhood expectations. I looked at the empty line where the hedge used to be and asked whether removing private landscaping without permission was consistent with neighborhood expectations. She looked away for a second. Then she said she had made decisions based on appearance and maybe underestimated personal attachment. That sentence surprised me because it sounded almost honest. I nodded and asked if she wanted to see the finished plan. She hesitated, but said yes. I walked her along the full 72 feet. Drainage channels, lighting path, decorative recesses, integrated planters, structural notes, everything deliberate. At one planter pocket, I explained I intended to grow climbing jasmine later. She stopped and looked at me. Then she asked quietly, "You are putting plants back?" I smiled and said not where somebody else can redesign them. We kept walking. At the end of the wall, I showed her one detail I had not mentioned to anyone. A recessed strip built into the inner side, only visible from my yard. Same spacing as the original hedge locations. 30 inches apart. Exactly the measurements my father used. She looked at the repeating pattern and asked what it was. I said memory. She stood there quietly longer than expected. Then she asked something I did not see coming. "Did your father help build the hedge?" I nodded. She looked at the wall again and said she thought she was fixing landscaping. She did not realize she was editing somebody's routine. We stood in silence for a second. Then she handed the complaint notice back to me and said unofficially she did not think it would go anywhere. I asked why. She looked at the street and said because now everybody knows what happened. That evening, I checked the neighborhood board out of curiosity. Somebody had posted updated photos of the project. Comments surprised me. "Looks great. Smart redesign. Privacy done right." One comment stopped me. A resident wrote, "Funny how nobody questioned the hedge until it disappeared." No replies. Just likes. Around sunset, I installed the final capstone. Clean line. Perfect level. Concrete dust on my sleeves. Wind moved across the yard and broke softly against something permanent. I stepped back and realized the strangest part was not that I built a wall. It was that the moment people understood why it existed, it stopped looking like a wall at all. Once the wall was finished, something unexpected happened. Nobody talked about the wall anymore. They talked about permission. That was the part one never planned for. The first Saturday after completion, I woke up automatically at 6:30 and opened the blinds out of habit. For a second, I expected to see the empty line again. Instead, I saw clean stone, soft morning shadows, and planter pockets waiting for spring. No exposed dirt. No unfinished edge. Just something complete sitting exactly where uncertainty used to live. I made coffee and walked outside. The air felt quieter. Not because sound disappeared. Because the yard finally had boundaries again. I ran my hand across the capstone surface. Cool concrete. Straight edge. My father used to tap finished work twice and say now it belongs to time instead of effort. I tapped the wall twice and laughed at myself immediately afterward. Around 8, Frank appeared carrying coffee because apparently that arrangement had become legally binding. He stood there for a minute looking at the finished project and said something I had not expected. "It does not feel closed off. It feels calmer." That word stayed with me. Calmer. We stood there drinking coffee while people walked dogs, and for the first time nobody slowed down to inspect. People just looked and kept moving. Adaptation happens fast once resistance becomes decoration. Around noon, the HOA held its monthly open meeting at the clubhouse. Normally, I skip those because I enjoy my free time and do not need updates about mailbox consistency. But this time, Frank convinced me to go because, according to him, there was neighborhood drama, and he considered himself a journalist. The room was fuller than normal. Folding chairs. Coffee. That tasted administrative. Patricia sat at the front with the board. She looked different somehow. Less performance. More paperwork. Halfway through the meeting, somebody raised a hand and asked whether landscaping authority rules had changed. Nobody said my name. Nobody said hedge. But everybody knew. Patricia adjusted papers and said the board reviewed property intervention procedures and clarified that aesthetic concerns do not authorize modification of homeowner improvements without consent unless clearly stated in governing documents. Translation: we should not have done that. Another resident raised his hand and asked whether existing privacy landscaping was protected. Patricia said homeowners maintain decision authority inside compliant boundaries. More translation: do not touch people's stuff. Then something interesting happened. An older neighbor stood up and said she removed decorative trees years ago because she thought HOA required it. Another resident said they changed paint colors after receiving suggestions they assumed were mandatory. Suddenly, the meeting stopped being about walls. People started comparing assumptions. Patricia listened quietly and took notes. No defense. No speeches. Just listening. On the way out, she stopped me near the door. She looked uncomfortable in a way that felt honest. Then she said she reviewed old records and realized no formal complaint about my hedge had ever existed. Just discussion. Discussion. I nodded. She looked down and said she thought acting quickly made communities easier to manage. Then she smiled slightly and added she forgot people actually live in them. I thanked her for telling me. That seemed to surprise her. Later that evening, I came home and found something outside the wall. Not on it. Beside it, a small envelope. Inside was a packet of hedge seeds and one handwritten sentence. Boundaries should not need rebuilding. No signature. None needed. I took the packet inside and placed it in the workshop next to the old survey and my father's tape measure. Then I walked back outside as sunset turned the concrete warm gray and realized something strange. I never wanted a fortress. I wanted the choice. The wall just happened to remind everyone that choice becomes visible the second somebody takes it away. The strange thing about permanence is that once people accept it, they start imagining they always supported it. 3 weeks after the wall was finished, life became normal again in the most suspicious way possible. Nobody questioned materials. Nobody discussed openness. Nobody suggested softer alternatives. Instead, people started asking practical questions. What finish did you use? How deep is the base? Does it help with sound? I answered politely and tried not to laugh because a month earlier concrete apparently threatened civilization. Now it was modern. My father would have enjoyed that. He believed opinions are usually weather with vocabulary. One Saturday morning, I was watering the planter pockets along the wall when I noticed movement across the street. Patricia was outside measuring something. Not secretly. Actual measuring tape. Stakes. Notebook. I ignored it for a while until she walked over and asked if I had a minute. She looked slightly embarrassed and held up a sketch. She wanted advice on replacing a decorative border near her front yard. I looked at the drawing and immediately recognized the feeling. Careful lines. Too many measurements. Somebody trying not to repeat a mistake. I asked what she wanted to build. She hesitated and said something quieter than usual. Something I choose this time. That sentence stayed with me. We stood by the wall while I looked over the sketch. Nothing dramatic. Just low stone edging and planter spacing. I suggested changing one angle and widening drainage. She wrote everything down seriously. Then she looked at the wall and asked something unexpected. Do you miss the hedge? I looked at the recessed spacing detail hidden inside the structure and thought about it for a second. I said yes, but not enough to wish this never happened. She nodded slowly. Then she admitted something that explained more than I expected. She said she had spent years trying to make the neighborhood look consistent because she thought consistency made people feel connected. But recently she realized she had been editing surfaces without understanding why people built them in the first place. We stood quietly for a second. Then she laughed once and said she still cannot believe the wall looks good. I told her concrete is underrated. That afternoon something happened that made me smile more than the construction ever did. A neighbor 2 houses down installed a new garden border. Nothing dramatic. Just a small sign beside it. Approved by me. Another house planted taller shrubs with a little wooden marker that said intentional. Somebody else painted their mailbox a different shade and apparently survived. Nobody rebelled. Nobody started chaos. People just seemed less afraid of asking questions. A week later, the HOA released updated community guidance. Simpler language. Clear approval processes. Actual distinctions between suggestions and requirements. The phrase aesthetic correction quietly disappeared. Nobody announced it. It just stopped existing. Frank claimed he deserved credit and printed himself a fake certificate. Nobody respected it. One evening near sunset, I walked the full length of the wall checking lights and planter irrigation. Small jasmine vines had started climbing from the integrated pockets. Tiny green lines against concrete. Living things attached to something permanent. I stopped at the middle where the original hedge line used to feel thickest. Wind moved differently now. Softer. Controlled. I reached into my pocket and found the old hedge seed packet somebody left weeks earlier. I opened it and looked at the seeds for a minute. Then I planted them. Not outside. Inside the wall. One small hidden row along the inner side where only I would see it grow. Same spacing my father used. 30 inches apart. Not replacing anything. Just remembering correctly. As I covered the soil, I realized something that took months to understand. Privacy was never the thing I lost. The thing I almost lost was deciding what mattered on my own property. The wall brought that back. The plants were just there to remind me why. Winter arrived slowly and without permission, which felt appropriate considering the year. The jasmine in the planter pockets had settled in. The hidden hedge seeds inside the wall had started becoming something small and green. Not enough to call a hedge, just enough to recognize. Every morning, I walked the inside edge with coffee and checked growth the way my father taught me. Same pace, same pauses, different structure. It took me a while to realize I had rebuilt the routine before I rebuilt the landscaping. That was the part that mattered. By December, nobody mentioned the project anymore. The wall stopped being a topic and became part of the street the way old trees eventually become invisible. People adjusted. That always fascinated me. The thing everybody claimed would ruin the neighborhood became background in less than 60 days. One Saturday morning, I opened the front door and found a small package leaning against the wall. No label. Inside was a framed photo. Not of the finished wall. It was a screenshot from my front camera taken the morning after the hedge disappeared. Empty dirt. Tape measure in my hand. Underneath, someone had written one sentence. Build what they cannot redefine. No signature. I laughed because apparently somebody in the neighborhood had become dramatic. I put the frame in the workshop beside my father's old survey. A week later, the HOA held the annual holiday gathering. Normally, I skip those too because folding tables and mandatory friendliness have limits. But Frank insisted there would be cookies and sociology. He was partially correct. The clubhouse looked exactly like every suburban event ever created. Coffee, string lights, name tags nobody respected. Halfway through the evening, the board announced updates for next year. Simpler approval language, clear homeowner consent requirements, better project documentation. Nobody applauded because nobody applauds administrative improvements. But people nodded. That felt bigger somehow. Then Patricia stood up. Not formal, just talking. She thanked residents for being patient during policy revisions and said something that surprised the room. She said communities should support choices, not replace them. Short sentence. No explanations. Then she laughed lightly and added that she had learned decorative landscaping can become surprisingly emotional. People smiled. Nobody brought up old stories. They did not need to. Later, she walked over holding a small paper bag. She handed it to me and said, "This belongs somewhere in your yard more than mine." Inside was the original white plastic marker. HOA landscape correction completed. She looked embarrassed and said she found it in storage while cleaning records. I stared at it for a second. Then I smiled and said thanks. She asked what I planned to do with it. I told her I had an idea. The next morning, I walked outside with a shovel and planted the marker where the hidden hedge row started inside the wall. Not visible from the street, only from inside the yard. Then I placed a small metal plaque underneath. One line. Original boundary removed. Replacement homeowner approved. I stepped back and laughed because my father would have absolutely approved of being slightly petty through documentation. Spring came again eventually. The jasmine climbed. The hidden hedge began filling in. Soft green against concrete. New growth inside permanent structure. One evening, I stood there watching sunset hit the capstones and realized something I had been missing the entire time. I never built a fortress. A fortress is something you build because you expect attack. This was something else. This was a reminder that nobody gets to improve your life by deleting parts of it first. My father used to say good construction disappears and leaves people feeling more themselves than before. I looked at the wall, the new growth, the quiet yard. Then I tapped the capstone twice and smiled because he was right again. They removed privacy. I built permanence.